In 1932, a woman named Edna Mercer walked into her kitchen with 14 cents, 3 potatoes, and a handful of dried beans. Outside, the bread line stretched 2 blocks. Her husband had not worked in 11 months. Her 4 children had not eaten a full meal in 4 days. But Edna did not panic. She opened a notebook her mother had given her, a notebook filled with dense handwritten instructions for surviving exactly this kind of disaster. By nightfall, she had fed her entire family. By the end of the month, she had fed her neighbors too. What was in that notebook? The same kind of hard-won knowledge that millions of American families quietly used to outlast one of the worst economic collapses in human history. These were not glamorous skills. They were not taught in schools. They were passed down in kitchens and barns and church basements by people who understood that survival was not a matter of luck. It was a matter of preparation and knowledge. Today, we are going to walk through 25 of the most powerful survival tricks that poor families during the Great Depression used to keep themselves alive, fed, clothed, and whole. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now before we get started. Because number 7 on this list is something almost no one talks about today, and number 1 will completely change the way you think about what it means to be truly prepared. Let us start with number 25. Number 25. Dandelion was not a weed, it was a grocery store. Families all across the rural South and Midwest who could not afford vegetables in the 1930s learned to harvest dandelion leaves in early spring before the plant flowered, when the greens were still tender and only slightly bitter. They blanched them, sautéed them in pork fat, or mixed them into soups. The roots were roasted and ground into a coffee substitute that actually tasted closer to chicory than the real thing. Dandelion leaves are loaded with vitamins A, C, and K, nutrients that were disappearing from poor families' diets as food costs exploded. Families who knew this trick avoided the nutritional deficiencies that were quietly crippling children in cities where nobody had a yard to harvest from. Number 24. Bread bag shoes. When the soles of children's shoes wore through, and during the Depression, they wore through fast, mothers began lining the insides with flattened bread bags before sending kids to school. The waxed paper inside the bags was waterproof enough to keep socks dry for a few hours. Some mothers layered 2 or 3 bags at a time. It was not a permanent fix, but it bought weeks before a new sole absolutely had to be cobbled. And in a family where every penny was counted twice, weeks mattered enormously. Number 23. Potato water was liquid gold. After boiling potatoes, most modern households pour the cloudy water down the drain. Depression-era cooks knew better. That starchy, mineral-rich liquid was the base for gravies, soups, and bread dough. It added body to thin broths and helped bread rise more consistently. Farmers' wives who baked several times a week kept a ceramic jug of potato water on the counter at all times. Nothing that carried nutrition was ever discarded. Number 22. Flour sacks became everything. The cotton sacks that commercial flour came in during the 1930s were not decorations. They were raw material. Mothers washed and bleached them, then sewed them into children's underwear, dish towels, aprons, pillowcases, and even simple dresses. Some flour companies, learning that women were selecting brands based on the patterns printed on the sacks, began printing their bags with cheerful floral and gingham designs specifically for this purpose. A family that bought flour regularly had a slow but steady supply of fabric coming into the house at no extra cost. Number 21. Lard was the multi-purpose miracle. Rendered pork fat, lard was simultaneously a cooking fat, a skin moisturizer, a leather conditioner, a rust preventative for cast iron, and a lip balm. Families that kept hogs, even small backyard operations, had access to this resource in abundance. It was also shelf-stable for months when stored in a cool, dark place. Families without hogs scraped together money for commercial lard tins and made them last as long as physically possible by rationing every spoonful. Number 20. Vinegar was the cleaning cabinet. Families could not afford separate products for cleaning counters, washing windows, removing stains, and treating minor infections. White vinegar did all of it. Diluted with water, it cleaned surfaces. Straight from the bottle, it cut grease on cast iron. Mixed with a little salt, it scrubbed rust from tools. A gallon of white vinegar cost pennies and replaced a shelf full of specialized products that Depression families simply could not buy. Number 19. They patched instead of replaced. When a shirt got an elbow hole, it did not go in the rag pile. It got a patch. Patches were cut from worn-out garments that had already served their purpose. The rag pile itself was carefully stratified. Fabric in good condition for patches and quilts, lesser fabric for cleaning rags, the absolute remnants for stuffing or kindling. Nothing left the household in a condition where it could still be useful. This attitude extended to everything: tools, furniture, shoes, pots, and fences. Number 18. Root cellars were the original refrigerators. Families who had even a small plot of land dug root cellars, underground chambers with earthen walls and floors that maintained a near constant temperature of 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Carrots, turnips, beets, cabbage, apples, potatoes, and winter squash stored in root cellars could last 4 to 6 months without any electricity. Families who planned their gardens carefully and harvested at the right time could feed themselves through February and March on food they had grown the previous summer and fall. If you have been watching this channel for a while, leave a comment right now telling me what skill from this era you already practice in your own life. We are reading every single one. Number 17. They kept a drippings jar on the stove. Every time meat was cooked, the rendered fat was carefully poured into a ceramic or glass jar kept near the stove. Bacon drippings, chicken fat, the grease from a pork chop. All of it went in. This accumulated fat was then used to fry eggs, saute vegetables, season cast iron, and enrich beans. It was flavor, calories, and cooking fuel all at once. A family that ate even small amounts of meat regularly could maintain a drippings jar that never ran out because it was constantly replenished. Number 16. Soap was made at home. Commercial soap was an expense that many families eliminated entirely by making their own from wood ash lye and rendered animal fat. The process required patience, weeks of curing time after the initial cook, but the result was a hard, functional soap that cleaned dishes, skin, laundry, and floors. Families that rendered their own lard and burned wood in their stoves had access to both ingredients at essentially no cost. Knowing how to make lye soap meant never having to choose between soap and food. Number 15. Barter replaced money. In communities where cash had become almost entirely absent, a functioning barter economy emerged almost spontaneously. A family with a milk cow traded quarts of milk for vegetables. A man who could sharpen tools traded his labor for meals. A woman who could sew traded alterations for firewood. These networks were informal, built entirely on trust and community reputation, and they kept goods and services moving through communities even when the formal economy had completely seized up. Families who were known as honest traders had access to far more resources than their cash savings would have suggested. Number 14. They grew protein, not just vegetables. Chickens were the Depression-era family's savings account. A small flock of 4 to 6 hens could produce enough eggs to feed a family and generate surplus for trading or selling. When a hen stopped laying, she became Sunday dinner. Rabbits were raised for the same reason. They reproduced quickly, required minimal space, and produced meat that could be stretched into stews and pies. Families who understood how to raise small animals had a source of protein that required almost no cash input once the initial animals were acquired. Number 13. They pressure canned everything. Home canning was not a hobby in the 1930s. It was an agricultural necessity. Families who grew gardens spent the entire late summer and early fall filling glass mason jars with tomatoes, green beans, corn, pickles, jellies, and fruit. A well-stocked cellar shelf going into winter might hold 200 or 300 jars. The USDA had been promoting pressure canning since the 1910s, specifically to eliminate the risk of botulism, and families who followed proper techniques had a safe, shelf-stable food supply that could last 18 months or longer. If you are not subscribed yet, please subscribe right now, because we are about to get into the tricks that most history books never bother to mention. Number 12. Cornmeal was the staple that never failed. Where wheat flour was expensive and subject to price swings, cornmeal was cheaper and more available in most of the American South and Midwest. Depression families mastered every possible use for it. cornbread, corn pone, grits, mush, Johnny cakes, corn dodgers, and cornmeal porridge. A single 25-pound bag of cornmeal combined with dried beans could sustain a family for weeks. The combination of corn and beans provided a complementary amino acid profile that, together, came close to a complete protein, something that was not well understood scientifically at the time, but was practiced intuitively by families who had been doing it for generations. Number 11. They repaired tools rather than buying new ones. A broken handle on a hoe or a cracked spoke on a wagon wheel was not a reason to replace the tool. It was a woodworking project. Men who could carve replacement handles from green wood, who could weld cracked metal with a coal forge, who could replace leather gaskets in a hand pump, kept their farms and households running without ever entering a hardware store. This kind of mechanical self-sufficiency was not seen as impressive in the 1930s. It was simply expected. A man who could not maintain his own tools was considered dangerously unprepared. Number 10. They ate parts of animals that modern families throw away. Organ meats, liver, kidneys, heart, tongue, and brain were not delicacies in Depression-era households. They were practical protein that cost less and often provided more nutrition than muscle meat. Chicken feet were simmered for stock. Beef bones were boiled for marrow. Pig's feet were pickled in brine. The head of a hog was boiled down and pressed into head cheese. Nothing from a butchered animal was discarded if it contained nutrition. Families who understood how to prepare these cuts had access to far more food value per animal than those who did not. Number 9. They made their own medicine when possible. Access to doctors and pharmacies was limited even before the Depression. In rural areas, many families had always relied on herbal and home remedies for common ailments. During the 1930s, these traditions became even more important. Elderberry syrup for colds and flu, plantain leaf poultices for infected cuts, ginger and peppermint teas for digestive problems, yarrow for fever and wound treatment. None of these replaced medical care for serious conditions, and families knew the difference. But for the ordinary ailments that struck throughout a year, a kitchen herbalist with a small dried herb collection could handle them without a single dollar spent. Number 8. Community labor was the Depression-era power tool. No single family could barn raise alone, harvest a field alone, or butcher a large hog alone. The practice of organized community labor, where neighbors gathered to complete large tasks together, then rotated to the next family's farm, meant that work that would have been impossible for one household was achievable in a single day. These gatherings, called working bees or frolics in different regions, were social events as much as practical ones. They reinforced the bonds of mutual obligation that kept communities intact when individual families would otherwise have collapsed. Leave a comment right now if your grandparents or great-grandparents ever talked about these kinds of community gatherings. We want to hear every story. Number 7. They used ash in ways most people have completely forgotten. Wood ash from the stove and fireplace was one of the most versatile resources a Depression family had. Spread on ice to prevent slipping, mixed with water to make lye for soap, sprinkled in the outhouse to control odor and kill pathogens, added to compost to balance acidity, used as a mild abrasive for scrubbing pots, dusted on garden beds to repel slugs and some insects. A family that burned wood, and almost every rural family did, had a continuous supply of this resource flowing out of their stove every single day, and families who knew how to use it wasted nothing. Number 6. They dried and stored herbs and spices from the garden. Salt, pepper, and other commercial spices were expenses that Depression families carefully rationed. But sage, thyme, rosemary, dill, oregano, mint, and dozens of other herbs could be grown at essentially no cost, harvested before frost, and dried in tied bundles hung from the kitchen ceiling. These herbs did more than add flavor. They extended the palatability of foods that, eaten plain, were hard to endure. A bean soup seasoned with garden sage and a bit of dried onion was a meal. The same soup without any seasoning was drudgery that eroded morale and made an already difficult situation feel psychologically unbearable. Number 5. They made vinegar at home. Beyond buying white vinegar, families who had access to apple scraps and wild or cultivated berries could ferment their own apple cider vinegar, one of the most useful household substances in existence. The process required only a crock, some raw fruit, water, and time. Homemade apple cider vinegar was used in cooking, food preservation, as a hair rinse that prevented lice and added shine, as a digestive tonic, and as a mild disinfectant. Families who had apple trees and understood fermentation had an essentially unlimited supply of this resource at zero cost beyond the labor of making it. Number 4. They understood the economics of the whole animal and the whole harvest. A pig killed in November was not dinner for a week. It was a carefully managed resource that had to last until the next slaughter. Every cut was designated in advance: the hams and shoulders for the longest storage, the belly for bacon, the fat back for rendering, the sausage meat for the sausage, the organs for the first week, the bones for ongoing stock production. The same philosophy applied to every harvest. Tomatoes that were slightly too ripe to store well were canned that day. Cabbage that had taken a light frost was turned into sauerkraut immediately. Nothing was allowed to decline from usable to wasted through inattention. Number 3. They kept a kitchen garden no matter how small their lot was. Urban families during the Depression did not have the luxury of farmland, but they had window boxes, fire escape railings, empty lots, church grounds, and the strips of soil along sidewalks. Tomatoes, lettuce, radishes, green onions, and herbs will grow in containers. Beans will climb a string tied to a fence. Families who understood that any amount of homegrown food reduced cash expenditure, even if only by a few dollars per month, tended gardens wherever they could find soil and light. In cities like Detroit and Chicago, vacant lots became informal community gardens that fed entire blocks. Number 2. They mastered the art of making something from nothing in the kitchen. The signature culinary achievement of the Depression was not a specific recipe. It was a philosophy. Leftover cornbread crumbled into milk became a meal called cornbread and milk that millions of Southern families ate for supper throughout the 1930s. Stale bread was never thrown out. It became bread pudding, French toast, stuffing, or breadcrumbs for coating fried foods. Overripe bananas became banana bread. Vegetable peels and wilted greens went into the stock pot. Cooking fat left in the pan became the beginning of the next dish. The best Depression-era cooks were not people who followed recipes. They were people who could look at whatever was in the house and build a meal from it, every single day, without exception. And now, number 1, the single most important survival skill that Great Depression families possessed, the one that made all the others possible, the one that modern life has almost completely erased. Number 1, they knew how to preserve food through every available method simultaneously, and they planned their entire year around the harvest calendar. This is not a single trick. It is a complete operating system for living with very little. A Depression-era farm wife who fully understood preservation was not just a cook. She was a logistician, a chemist, a nutritionist, and a seasonal planner all at once. In January and February, she was eating from what she had put up in August, September, and October. In March, she was planning what she would plant in April. In May, she was transplanting seedlings and foraging for spring greens. In June and July, she was putting up early harvests and monitoring the root cellar for anything beginning to go soft. In August, the canning and drying went into full intensity. 12-hour days of blanching, packing, sealing, and checking jar seals. In September and October, the root vegetables went into the cellar, the winter squash went on the shelf, the dried beans went into cloth sacks, and the butchering was planned. In November, the hog was killed. The lard was rendered, the sausage was ground and smoked, and the hams were hung. In December, the preparation slowed slightly, but the monitoring never stopped. Every method was used. Water bath canning for high-acid foods. Pressure canning for low-acid vegetables and meats. Drying for herbs, fruit, beans, and corn. Fermentation for cabbage, cucumbers, and fruit vinegar. Root cellaring for root vegetables and apples. Smoking for meat. Salt curing for ham and bacon. Lard packing for sausage and pork. Honey preservation for some fruits. Sugar preservation for jams and jellies. She did not do any single one of these things because she enjoyed them. She did all of them together because each one filled a gap the others left. Canned goods were convenient, but required glass and fuel for processing. Dried foods were lightweight and took no fuel to store but were vulnerable to moisture and pests. Root-cellar items required no processing, but took space and careful monitoring. Together, these methods created a redundant, overlapping food security system that could survive the failure of any single component. The families that thrived during the Great Depression were not lucky. They were not unusually tough or unusually resourceful in some genetic or individual sense. They were people who had inherited, or had quickly learned, a complete system for living without depending on institutions that could fail. When the banks closed, they still had food. When the stores raised prices, they already had supplies. When the neighbors went hungry, they had enough to share. That is the real lesson of the Great Depression. Not any individual trick, not a single clever hack, but the understanding that genuine security comes from a deep knowledge base, a working relationship with the land and the seasons, and a community of people who share skills and resources with each other. The families who survived best were the ones who had spent decades or generations building exactly that. So here is your challenge. Pick one skill from this list, just one, and learn it completely before winter. Not the general idea of it, not the YouTube overview. Actually do it. Can a jar of tomatoes, make a batch of lye soap, grow something edible in whatever space you have, render lard, learn to patch a garment so the patch lasts. These are not difficult skills. They are skills that millions of ordinary people performed as a matter of course for most of human history. You can learn them too. And if the moment ever comes when you need them, you will be standing exactly where Edna Mercer stood in 1932, not panicking, but opening your notebook and getting to work. Leave a comment below telling us which of these 25 tricks surprised you most, or which one you already practice in your own life. We are building a community here of people who take this knowledge seriously, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.